The next few nights at the hospital passed quietly, but Nix found herself unable to stay away from Elian's room. After her shifts, she would stop by, lingering at his bedside. At first, her visits were brief, just a few moments to straighten his blanket or replace the wilting flower she'd left. Yet, over time, she began to talk, her words hesitant but genuine. "I saw your story on the news today," she murmured one evening, adjusting the machines by his bed even though it wasn't her job. "They're all saying how important you are, how everyone is waiting for you to wake up, but no one talks about what you might be feeling. Do you feel trapped too?" Her voice faltered, and she glanced at him, half expecting a response even though she knew better. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she continued. "Maybe it's because you can't judge me. You're just here." Nix spoke of her life, her family, and the struggles she faced. She told him about the cramped apartment she shared with her younger siblings and her mother, who worked long hours in the factories that supplied parts for corporations like the one Elian's family owned. She talked about her dream of becoming a nurse, how it seemed so far away, and how she sometimes wondered if it was worth the fight. As the nights went on, her stories grew more personal. She told him about the brother she had lost in a factory accident when she was a child, about how it had shaped her desire to help others. Her words were tinged with pain, but also hope, a quiet, unyielding determination to rise above her circumstances. Though Elian remained unresponsive, Nix felt an odd sense of comfort in his presence. It was as if speaking her thoughts aloud to him made them feel real, tangible. She didn't expect anything in return, and yet, she found herself drawn to the stillness of his room, the quiet intimacy of sharing her secrets with someone who couldn't interrupt or judge. One night, as she sat by his bedside, she noticed something different. His fingers twitched, a small but unmistakable movement. Nix froze, her heart pounding. She leaned closer, studying his face for any sign of awareness. "Elian?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. There was no response, but the twitch had been real. It gave her hope. A fragile, fleeting hope that perhaps he could hear her after all. The following days brought a subtle shift in Nix's demeanor. She began to leave small tokens by his bedside. Pressed flowers, handwritten notes with little sayings of encouragement. She even hummed softly as she worked, melodies from her childhood that carried a sense of solace. Meanwhile, the hospital buzzed with activity as reporters clamored for updates on Elian's condition. His family visited sporadically, their appearances more for the cameras than for him. His fiancée, Dirya, arrived once with an entourage of stylists and assistants, her presence cold and distant. "He looks so pale," Dirya remarked, her tone devoid of genuine concern as she inspected him from a distance. "The cameras will pick up on that if they get too close. Someone should do something about it." Nix watched from the hallway, her jaw tightening. It wasn't her place to interfere, but the indifference in Dirya's voice stirred something in her, a protective instinct she didn't fully understand. When Dirya left, Nix slipped into the room, her gaze lingering on Elian's face. "She doesn't deserve you," she muttered under her breath, then quickly shook her head. "Not that it's my business." As the weeks passed, Nix's nightly visits became a quiet routine. She began to read to him, bringing books from the hospital library or reciting poems she remembered from her school days. She told him about the patients she had seen that day, the small victories and heartbreaks that came with working in the hospital. Unbeknownst to Nix, her presence was beginning to leave an imprint on Elian. In the depths of his coma, her voice became a beacon, threading through the fragmented images of his dreams. He saw flashes of her face, felt the warmth of her words even if he couldn't fully comprehend them. One night, as she finished reading a passage from an old book about hope, Nix reached out impulsively, her fingers brushing lightly against his hand. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver through her. She drew back quickly, chastising herself for the impropriety. Yet the moment lingered in her mind long after she had left the room. Outside, the city of Leary continued its relentless pace, but within the walls of the hospital, a quiet connection was forming. one that neither Nix nor Elian fully understood yet. And as the machines by his bedside hummed softly, a new hope began to stir, setting the stage for the changes that were about to unfold. The sterile glow of the hospital lights illuminated the room as Elian's hand twitched again, this time more pronounced. Nix, who had been adjusting his blanket, froze mid-motion. Her heart thudded in her chest as she watched his fingers flex, the faintest sign of movement. "Elian?" she whispered, stepping closer to his bedside. His eyelids fluttered, though they didn't fully open. Nix's breath caught. It was the first tangible proof she'd seen that he was beginning to awaken. The machines around him beeped steadily, offering no clue as to what was happening beneath his still exterior. Nix hesitated, then reached out, gently placing her hand over his. His skin was warm, the slightest tremor passing through his fingers as if he were trying to respond to her touch. "I don't know if you can hear me," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But you're not alone. You're going to be okay." The next morning, the doctors confirmed what Nix had suspected. Elian's brain activity had increased, and they believed he was on the verge of waking. The news spread quickly, drawing a flurry of attention from the media and his family. The once quiet hospital room was now a hub of activity, with nurses and specialists coming in and out. Nix watched from the periphery, her presence unnoticed by most. Dirya arrived in a flurry of motion, her designer heels clicking against the tiled floor as she swept into the room. "Elian!" she exclaimed, leaning over him with a carefully curated expression of concern. "You're coming back to me. I knew you would." She lingered for a few minutes, taking photos to share with the press before retreating to the hallway to speak with reporters. Nix clenched her fists, her frustration mounting as she observed the superficiality of it all. Later that evening, when the bustle had died down, Nix returned to Elian's room. The dim lighting cast soft shadows across his face, and for the first time, she noticed the faintest hint of color returning to his cheeks. "You're waking up," she said softly, sitting down in the chair beside him. "I guess this is goodbye for me. Once you're awake, you'll go back to your world, and I'll stay in mine." Her voice cracked slightly, and she shook her head, laughing at herself. "Listen to me, like you'd even remember me once this is all over." Just as she reached for the book she'd been reading to him earlier, a soft sound stopped her. It was barely more than a murmur, but it sent a jolt through her. "Don't stop." Nix stared at him, her heart hammering. His eyes were still closed, but his lips moved faintly, as though struggling to form words. "Don't stop what?" she asked, leaning forward, unsure if she'd imagined it. He didn't respond, but his fingers twitched again, and for the first time, Nix saw his brow furrow slightly, as if he were trying to wake fully. The next day, Elian's awakening was complete. His eyes opened slowly, squinting against the harsh light of the room. The world around him was blurry at first, the faces of the doctors and nurses swimming in and out of focus. "Elian, welcome back," one of the doctors said, their voice calm but laced with relief. "You've been unconscious for months, but you're going to be okay." Elian blinked, his gaze drifting to the faces around him. Dirya was there, her perfectly styled hair and flawless makeup standing in stark contrast to the sterile hospital room. She smiled brightly, leaning over to place a light kiss on his forehead. "You scared me," she said, her tone more performative than genuine. "But I knew you'd come back to me." Elian's eyes shifted, searching the room. Amid the sea of unfamiliar faces, he spotted Nix standing near the doorway, her cleaning supplies in hand. Their eyes met briefly, and something flickered in his expression. A hint of recognition, though he couldn't place why. Dirya followed his gaze, her smile faltering slightly. "Who's that?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Just a cleaner," Nix said quickly, lowering her gaze and stepping back into the hallway. She didn't want to draw attention to herself, especially not with Dirya there. But as Elian settled back into the bed, fragments of memories began to surface. The sound of a voice soft, soothing, the touch of a hand against his, the scent of flowers he couldn't quite name. Later that evening, when the room was quiet again, Elian found himself replaying those fragments in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there with him, someone who had stayed by his side when he was at his most vulnerable. As the days went on, his recovery progressed. He began to regain his strength, and the hospital staff helped him relearn the simplest of movements. During one of these sessions, he spotted Nix again, mopping the floor outside his room. "You," he called out, his voice hoarse but steady. Nix paused, startled. She glanced around, unsure if he was speaking to her. "Yes, you," he said, his tone softening. "Can you come here?" Hesitant, Nix set aside her mop and approached his bedside. "Is there something you need, sir?" Elian studied her face, the faint traces of exhaustion etched into her features. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't quite place it. "I feel like I know you," he said slowly. Were you here while I was unconscious?" Nix hesitated, her cheeks flushing. I cleaned the rooms. That's all." Elian frowned slightly, sensing there was more to the story. "Did you talk to me?" She looked away, twisting her hands nervously. "Sometimes," she admitted quietly. "It's silly, I know. You couldn't hear me." A small smile tugged at the corner of Elian's lips. "I think I did." Nix's eyes widened, but before she could respond, Dirya's sharp voice cut through the moment. "Elian, darling, what are you doing talking to the staff?" she asked, stepping into the room with her usual air of superiority. Nix stepped back quickly, muttering an apology before retreating to the hallway. Elian watched her go, a strange sense of loss settling over him. He turned back to Dirya, who was already fussing over his appearance, but his mind lingered on the woman who had been there for him when no one else had. And for the first time, he began to question the life he was so eager to return to. Elian stared out of the hospital window, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. His recovery had progressed quickly. The doctors were impressed by his resilience, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was missing, something he couldn't quite name, or someone. Dirya was by his side almost constantly, arranging interviews and planning his triumphant return to the public eye. But her presence, instead of offering comfort, felt stifling. She filled the silence with discussions about his image, their wedding plans, and his company's future, leaving no room for him to express himself. "Elian, we need to talk about the gala," Dirya said one afternoon, sitting primly in a chair beside his bed. "The board insists we reschedule as soon as possible. They say it's essential for public confidence." Elian barely glanced at her. "I just woke up, Dirya. Can't it wait?" She gave him a tight smile. "Your recovery is important, of course, but appearances matter. People need to see that you're still strong, still capable." He turned away, his gaze drifting back to the window. The alien cityscape beyond was alive with motion, a stark contrast to the emptiness he felt inside. When Dirya finally left for a meeting, Elian sighed in relief. The room felt lighter without her. As he sat in silence, the door opened cautiously, and Nix stepped inside with a cart of cleaning supplies. She froze when she saw him awake and alert. "Oh, I'm sorry. I can come back later." "No, it's fine," Elian interrupted, his tone softer than it had been with anyone else. "Please stay." Nix hesitated, then entered, her movements careful as she began tidying the room. Elian watched her quietly, his curiosity growing. "You were there when I was unconscious, weren't you?" he asked after a long pause. Nix didn't look up. "I cleaned your room, yes?" "No, it's more than that," he insisted. "I remember your voice and the flowers. You left them, didn't you?" Her cheeks flushed, and she busied herself rearranging a vase on the windowsill. "I didn't think you'd remember," she admitted finally. "I do," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Thank you." Nix glanced at him, surprised. She had expected him to dismiss her, to brush off her small acts of kindness as insignificant. But the gratitude in his eyes was genuine. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I just wanted to help." Elian nodded, his gaze lingering on her. There was something about her presence that felt grounding, like an anchor in the chaos of his life. Over the next few days, their interactions grew more frequent. Nyx continued her work as usual, but Elian found reasons to keep her in the room longer. He asked her questions about her life, her work, her dreams. At first, she was hesitant to open up, but his sincerity wore down her walls. One afternoon, as she wiped down the counters, she shared a memory of her brother, the one who had inspired her dream of becoming a nurse. "He always said I had a knack for making people feel better," she said, a wistful smile on her lips. "Even when things were tough, he believed in me." Elian listened intently, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her voice. "Why didn't you become a nurse?" he asked gently. "Life got in the way," she said simply, not meeting his eyes. Elian nodded, understanding more than she realized. "You deserve to follow that dream," he said. Nyx looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It's not that simple." One evening, after a particularly exhausting round of therapy, Elian found himself thinking of Nyx again. He couldn't deny the growing connection he felt toward her. It was unlike anything he had experienced before. Simple, genuine, and untainted by expectations or appearances. That night, he confronted Dirya. "Why weren't you here when I needed you?" he asked bluntly, his tone sharper than he intended. Dirya blinked, taken aback. "Elian, what are you talking about? I was here. I came to visit. For the cameras," he said, his voice laced with disappointment. "Not for me. You cared more about how it looked than how I felt." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not fair. I have responsibilities, Elian. I couldn't just drop everything." "You didn't even try," he countered, his frustration bubbling over. "Do you even care about me? Or is it just the image we project together?" Dirya's expression hardened. "You've changed," she said coldly. "Ever since you woke up, you've been different, distant." "Maybe I have changed," Elian admitted. "And maybe that's not a bad thing." Dirya didn't respond, but the tension in the room was palpable as she turned on her heel and left. The next morning, Elian found himself seeking out Nyx again. She was in the break room, sipping a cup of tea. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Nyx looked up, surprised. "Of course. Is everything okay?" He nodded, though his expression was far from relaxed. I wanted to thank you again. For everything. You didn't have to, but you did. And it meant more to me than I can say." Nyx smiled faintly. "You don't owe me anything, Elian." "I don't feel like I do," he said. "But I want to know you better. I want to understand why you cared enough to stay." Her gaze softened, and for a moment, the walls she had built around herself seemed to waver. "Maybe because I know what it's like to feel alone," she said quietly. Elian nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. It was a small gesture, but it carried a world of meaning. Nyx didn't pull away, but she didn't move closer either. They stayed like that for a moment, the silence between them filled with unspoken truths. As the sounds of the hospital buzzed faintly in the background, Elian felt something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of purpose, of clarity. And for the first time, he began to envision a future that wasn't dictated by others' expectations, but by what truly mattered. Elian spent the next few days in quiet reflection, the hours marked by physical therapy sessions and brief interactions with the hospital staff. But it was Nyx's presence he found himself waiting for. Though their conversations were brief and her demeanor often shy, there was something profoundly grounding about her honesty. Dirya's visits, in contrast, had grown increasingly strained. She seemed more preoccupied with managing the media narrative surrounding Elian's return than with Elian himself. Their conversations often ended in terse exchanges, leaving Elian feeling more alienated than ever. One morning, as Elian sat by the window sipping his tea, he caught sight of Nyx walking past his room. She was carrying a bundle of fresh linens, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Nyx," he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet corridor. She stopped, glancing in nervously. "Yes, sir? Can you come in for a moment?" Nyx hesitated, glancing at the clock on the wall. I don't want to get in the way. You won't, Elian said, his tone softer. Please. She entered cautiously, setting the linens aside. Is there something you need? Elian shook his head. No, I needed someone to talk to. Someone who isn't trying to sell me something or fix my image. Nyx blinked in surprise, unsure how to respond. I don't know if I'm the right person for that, she said quietly. You're exactly the right person, Elian said firmly. You're honest. You don't expect anything from me. That's rare in my world. Nyx shifted uncomfortably, her gaze dropping to the floor. I'm just a cleaner, Elian. There's not much I can offer someone like you. You've already given me more than most, he said, leaning forward slightly. You stayed when no one else did. That means something to me. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the hospital machinery filled the silence, creating a strange sense of intimacy. Finally, Nyx sighed, meeting his gaze. I stayed because I felt like you needed someone, and maybe because I know what it's like to be forgotten. Elian's chest tightened at her words. You're not forgotten, he said, his voice laced with emotion. Not by me. Later that day, Elian was wheeled into the garden for the first time since waking. The fresh air and the scent of alien blossoms filled his senses, a welcome relief from the sterile confines of the hospital. Nyx was there, tending to a patch of flowers near the far edge of the garden. Elian watched her for a moment, admiring the way her movements were precise yet gentle. You seem to have a talent for taking care of things, he remarked as she approached with a small watering can. Nyx glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. It's just part of the job. No, Elian said, shaking his head. It's more than that. You care. About people, about things. That's rare. Nyx didn't respond immediately. Instead, she knelt beside him, adjusting the flowers in the nearby planter. Maybe it's because I know how fragile things can be, she said quietly. How easily they can break. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Elian leaned forward, his hand brushing hers as she reached for the same flower. Thank you, he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. For everything. Nyx looked up, their faces inches apart. For a moment the world seemed to stand still. Then she pulled back, her cheeks flushing. I should get back to work, she said hurriedly, rising to her feet. Elian watched her go, a strange mix of longing and admiration settling in his chest. That evening, Elian confronted Dirya again. She had burst into his room with her usual flurry of energy, holding up a tablet displaying plans for the rescheduled gala. I've already informed the board, she said briskly. We'll make your first public appearance the highlight of the season. Dirya, Elian interrupted, his tone sharp. I'm not sure I want to go. She stared at him, incredulous. What are you talking about? This is your chance to remind everyone who you are. Maybe I don't want to be that person anymore, he said evenly. Her eyes narrowed. You're still recovering. You're confused. Once you're back in the spotlight, you'll remember why all of this matters. Will I? Elian asked, his voice rising. Because right now, all I see is a life that feels empty, superficial. Do you even care about me, Dirya? Or do you just care about what I represent? Dirya froze, her expression hardening. You're being ridiculous, she said finally. You've always had everything. What more could you possibly want? Elian didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, his thoughts drifting to Nyx and the quiet strength she had shown him. The next day, Elian sought out Nyx again. She was in the staff lounge, sipping a cup of tea and jotting something down in a worn notebook. What are you writing? He asked, sitting across from her. Nyx quickly closed the notebook, her cheeks flushing. Nothing important. Let me see, Elian said, his tone teasing. Nyx hesitated, then handed it over reluctantly. Elian opened it, his eyes scanning the carefully written notes and sketches inside. You're studying, he said, his voice tinged with surprise. For nursing? Nyx nodded, her expression guarded. It's a long shot, but It's what I've always wanted to do. Elian smiled, handing the notebook back. You'll make an incredible nurse. Nix laughed softly. You don't even know me that well. I know enough, Elian said, his voice firm. You have a gift for caring. You shouldn't let anyone take that away from you. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was right. And as they sat together, the distance between their worlds began to feel a little less insurmountable. Elian sat at the edge of his hospital bed, gazing at the small stack of papers Dirya had left behind. They were proposals, schedules, and financial reports, all meant to pull him back into the world he had once thrived in. But the words felt hollow, disconnected from the man he was becoming. The door creaked open, and Elian looked up to see Nix standing hesitantly in the doorway. She was holding a fresh bouquet of alien flowers, their luminescent petals glowing faintly. I thought these might brighten your room, she said softly, stepping inside. Elian smiled, gesturing for her to come closer. You have a way of making everything brighter, don't you? Nix's cheeks flushed, and she busied herself arranging the flowers in a vase. It's just a small gesture, she murmured. To you, maybe, Elian replied. But to me it means a lot. As she worked, Elian couldn't help but notice the care she poured into even the simplest tasks. There was an authenticity to her, a quiet strength that drew him in. Nix, he said after a moment. Can I ask you something? She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes curious. Of course. What made you stay? When I was in the coma, why did you keep coming back? Nix hesitated, her hands stilling on the vase. I'm not sure, she admitted. Maybe because I saw someone who needed kindness. And maybe because I needed someone to care for, too. Elian's chest tightened at her words. You gave me something no one else did, he said quietly. You saw me. Not the air, not the name, just me. Nix turned to face him, her expression guarded yet vulnerable. You're not what I expected, she said. You're different. Different how? He asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. She took a step closer, her gaze meeting his. You care. You listen. That's not something I'm used to. Elian reached out, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief but electric, a spark that neither could ignore. I think we both needed each other, he said softly. The following days brought subtle yet significant changes. Elian began spending more time with Nix, seeking out her company whenever he could. They talked about everything and nothing. Her dreams of becoming a nurse, his struggles to reconcile the life he had with the one he wanted, and the quiet moments they both cherished in between. Nix, in turn, found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She told Elian about her family, her brother's illness, and the sacrifices she had made to support him. And though she tried to keep her distance, she couldn't deny the growing connection between them. One afternoon, as they sat together in the hospital garden, Elian turned to her with a thoughtful expression. What's stopping you from pursuing nursing? He asked. Nix sighed, twirling a blade of grass between her fingers. Money, mostly, and time. I can't afford to stop working. Elian nodded, his mind racing. What if I could help? Nix's eyes widened. Elian, you don't have to. I want to. He interrupted, his tone firm. You've done so much for me, Nix. Let me do this for you. She shook her head, her expression conflicted. I don't want to feel like I owe you anything. I need to earn it myself. You wouldn't owe me, Elian said gently. This isn't about charity. It's about believing in someone who deserves a chance. Nix looked away, her emotions warring within her. I'll think about it, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Meanwhile, Dirya's frustrations continued to grow. She could sense the shift in Elian, the way he seemed distant and unyielding whenever they spoke. She blamed the hospital, the coma, anything but herself. One evening, she cornered Elian in his room, her tone sharp and accusatory. What's going on with you? She demanded. You've been avoiding me, shutting me out. This isn't like you. Elian leaned back against the headboard, his expression weary. Maybe this is who I am now, he said evenly. Maybe I've realized there's more to life than the image we project. Dirya's eyes narrowed. Is this about that cleaner? I've seen the way you look at her. Elian's jaw tightened. Nyx has been more honest and caring than anyone else in my life, including you. Her face flushed with anger. She's beneath you, Elian. You can't seriously think she belongs in your world. Maybe I don't want to be in that world anymore, he shot back. Maybe I want something real. Dirya stared at him, stunned into silence. Finally, she turned on her heel and stormed out, leaving Elian alone with his thoughts. That night, Elian found Nyx in the staff lounge, her notebook open on the table in front of her. She looked up as he entered, her expression softening. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi," he replied, sitting across from her. "I had an argument with Dirya." Nyx frowned. "Is everything okay?" "It will be," Elian said, his voice resolute. "I'm done pretending to be someone I'm not, and I'm done letting other people decide what my life should look like." Nyx's gaze softened, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "That's brave of you." "It's because of you," Elian admitted. "You've shown me what it means to be genuine, to care without expecting anything in return. You've changed me, Nyx." She looked down, her cheeks flushing. "I didn't do anything special. You did everything," he said, reaching out to take her hand. "And I don't want to lose that." Nyx met his gaze, her heart pounding. For a moment, the rest of the world faded away, leaving only the two of them. "Elian," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This can't be easy." "I don't care," he said firmly. "You're worth it." And as their hands intertwined, a new chapter in their lives began to take shape, one built on honesty, respect, and the undeniable pull of their hearts. Elian's days began to shift in a way that felt both unsettling and exciting. While he continued his therapy and engaged in the occasional meeting with his family's company representatives, his heart and thoughts were constantly pulled elsewhere. Nyx, she was like a tether keeping him grounded in a world that had once felt alien to him. Even as he grew up on this planet, he began spending more time in the hospital garden, knowing it was one of Nyx's favorite places. She wasn't always there, but when she was, they would sit together under the glowing trees, their conversations flowing freely. Elian found himself smiling more, laughing at her dry humor or her stories about her younger brother. For someone who claimed to be ordinary, Nyx carried extraordinary strength, and Elian couldn't stop himself from admiring her. One late afternoon, after a particularly grueling therapy session, Elian wheeled himself into the garden and found Nyx sitting on a stone bench. She was staring up at the twin moons, their soft glow casting a faint shimmer over her features. She looked peaceful, almost lost in her thoughts, and Elian couldn't help but stop and simply watch her for a moment. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Nyx turned, startled, but her expression softened when she saw him. "They're not worth much," she replied, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Anything you think about is worth something," Elian countered, moving closer. Nyx shook her head, her gaze returning to the sky. "I was just thinking about my brother. He used to love looking at the moons when we were kids. He'd say they were watching over us, protecting us." Elian tilted his head, studying her. "You miss him?" She nodded, her expression wistful. "Every day. He's all the family I have left, and I want to give him a better life. That's why I started working here, to save up for his treatments." Elian felt a pang of guilt. He had spent his life surrounded by wealth and privilege, rarely considering the struggles others faced. Nyx's dedication and selflessness were humbling. "You'll make it happen," he said softly. "You've already done so much for him." Nyx glanced at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I hope so. It's just hard sometimes. Feeling like no matter how much I do, it'll never be enough." Elian reached out, his hand covering hers. The touch was light but firm, an unspoken promise of support. "You're stronger than you realize," he said. "And you're not alone in this." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. Nyx opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she squeezed his hand, her gratitude conveyed in the simple gesture. As the days passed, the bond between Elian and Nyx deepened. Their moments together became the highlight of his recovery, and he found himself looking forward to every shared glance, every conversation. But not everyone was pleased. Dirya had been watching from the sidelines, her frustration mounting with each passing day. She had tried to pull Elian back into the orbit of high society, organizing meetings and events to remind him of his obligations. But he was distant, distracted, and she knew exactly who was to blame. One evening, as Nyx was leaving Elian's room, she found herself face to face with Dirya in the hallway. The older woman's gaze was cold, her posture rigid. "Miss Nyx," Dirya said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Nyx hesitated, glancing back at Elian's door. "Of course," she said finally, her tone cautious. Dirya gestured for her to follow, leading her to a quiet corner of the hallway. When she turned to face Nyx, her expression had hardened. "I've noticed you've been spending quite a bit of time with Elian," Dirya began, her tone sharp. "Perhaps too much time." Nyx bristled, her instincts telling her to retreat, but she held her ground. "Elian is recovering. I'm just trying to help." "Help?" Dirya scoffed. "You're a cleaner, not a nurse. Your job is to maintain the hospital, not to get involved in matters that don't concern you." Nyx clenched her fists, her heart pounding. "Elian is a person, not a matter, and he asked for my company. I didn't force myself into his life." Dirya's lips curled into a sneer. "Don't delude yourself into thinking this is anything more than a passing distraction for him. People like Elian don't end up with people like you." The words hit Nyx like a slap, but she refused to let them show. "Maybe you don't know him as well as you think you do," she said quietly. Dirya's eyes flashed with anger. "Stay away from him," she hissed. "For your sake as much as his. Whatever this is, it won't end well." With that, Dirya turned and strode away, leaving Nyx standing alone in the dimly lit hallway. Her chest felt tight, her mind racing with doubts. Was Dirya right? Was she foolish to think there could be something real between her and Elian? Later that night, Elian noticed Nyx's absence. She hadn't stopped by for their usual evening chat, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, when he spotted her cleaning a nearby corridor, he called out to her. "Nyx, wait," he said, wheeling himself toward her. She froze, her shoulders tense, but didn't turn around. "I'm busy, Elian," she said, her voice strained. "Please," he said, his tone gentle. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" Nyx hesitated, then sighed and turned to face him. "Dirya spoke to me," she admitted. "She doesn't think I belong in your life." Elian's jaw tightened. "Dirya doesn't get to decide who belongs in my life. That's my choice." Nyx shook her head, her expression pained. "She's right, though. We come from two completely different worlds. I don't fit into yours, Elian." "I don't care about worlds or status," he said firmly. "I care about you, and I'm not going to let anyone, not Dirya, not anyone else, take that away from me." Nyx stared at him, her resolve wavering under the weight of his words. "It's not that simple," she whispered. "Maybe it is," Elian countered, reaching for her hand. "Maybe we just need to decide what we want and fight for it." For a moment, Nyx let herself believe him, let herself imagine a world where they could be together. But the doubts lingered, and she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Still, as Elian's fingers intertwined with hers, she felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, beautiful thing that refused to be extinguished. Elian's world had become a whirlwind of decisions, feelings, and revelations. The days after his confrontation with Dirya had been intense, filled with moments of uncertainty but also undeniable clarity. Nyx had agreed to meet with him more often, though there were still barriers they both had to navigate. He could see it in the way she hesitated when he reached for her hand or the way her eyes shifted to the door as if expecting someone to stop them. Her fear of crossing the line between their worlds was palpable, but Elian was done hiding his feelings. One afternoon, after a particularly draining session with his therapist, Elian found himself in the quiet hospital garden once again. The gentle rustle of the alien plants soothed him, offering peace amidst the chaos of his thoughts. Nyx was there, sitting on their usual bench, but today there was something different about her. She was looking at him, but not with the usual warmth. There was a distance in her eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. "Nyx," he called softly. She turned toward him, and her smile was forced, not the easy, genuine one he'd grown used to. "Hey, Elian," she replied, her voice lacking its usual vibrancy. Elian sat down beside her, close but not too close. "What's wrong? You've been avoiding me." "I haven't been avoiding you," she said, her eyes flicking to the side. I think we need to talk." A weight settled in his stomach, something he had been dreading. "Okay, what's on your mind?" Nyx took a deep breath, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot about what Dirya said, and about us. I don't want to cause you more trouble, Elian. You don't need someone like me in your life. You've got enough on your plate without worrying about—" "Elian," he interrupted, his voice firm but soft. "You're not just someone like anyone else to me. You're Nyx, and that means everything." She shook her head, her lips trembling. "It's not that simple. You're from a world of wealth and power. You don't have to worry about anything. But Her voice broke, and for a second, she looked vulnerable, unsure. Elian reached for her hand, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. "You think I don't have worries? You think I don't struggle with what my life is supposed to be now? You've changed everything for me, Nyx. I see things differently, and I want you in my life, no matter what." She withdrew her hand, her eyes searching his face, unsure of his sincerity. "But what about Dirya? What about your family? They'll never accept me." Elian exhaled slowly, frustration rising within him. "I don't care what they think anymore. This isn't about them. This is about us." Nyx swallowed hard, clearly torn. She was afraid. Elian could see it in the way she bit her lip, in the way her fingers trembled. And, for the first time, he realized that she was more afraid of losing him than of the consequences they might face. "I don't know if I can do this, Elian," she whispered, her eyes full of conflict. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for what's to come." Elian leaned forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "Then let me help you be strong. We'll do this together." For a long moment, Nyx didn't respond. Her eyes were cast downward, her expression unreadable. But then, slowly, she looked up, her gaze meeting his with a mixture of determination and fear. "I don't want to lose you," she said quietly. "I don't want to push you away." Elian's heart skipped a beat. "You won't lose me. Not ever." The air between them felt charged, heavy with everything unsaid. Elian could feel his pulse quicken, the magnetic pull between them undeniable. Slowly, carefully, he reached out once more, his hand hovering near hers. Nyx's breath caught, but this time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she placed her hand in his, their fingers interlacing with a sense of rightness that sent a thrill through his chest. "I'm not asking for anything from you except for your trust," Elian said, his voice hushed but intense. "You've shown me who you are, Nyx, and that's more than enough. I want to be with you, to support you, to be the person you deserve. We'll face whatever comes next, together." Nyx squeezed his hand, her eyes softening. She didn't say anything, but her silence spoke volumes. The tension that had lingered between them seemed to dissipate, replaced by something tender, something fragile but real. The following days were filled with a quiet, growing closeness. Elian spent more time with Nyx, and with every shared moment, the bond between them deepened. Their connection was no longer a secret whispered in the corners of the hospital. They were becoming something real. Yet, even as they moved forward, they both knew that the real challenge was yet to come. The world outside their small sanctuary was watching, waiting. Dirya was still a looming presence, her cold, disapproving glances following them wherever they went. But neither Elian nor Nyx let that deter them. They knew their love wasn't about impressing anyone or meeting expectations. It was about what they shared, the quiet moments, the trust, the small gestures that spoke louder than words. One night, after an evening walk in the garden, Elian and Nyx found themselves sitting by the small koi pond, the moonlight reflecting off the water. The quiet hum of the world around them felt almost sacred, and for a moment, Elian allowed himself to breathe, to just be with Nyx. "I want to help you," Elian said, his voice steady. "I know you've been working so hard for your brother. What if I helped? What if I used what I have to make sure he gets the care he needs?" Nyx turned to him, her face a mix of surprise and hesitation. "Elian, I can't ask you to do that. You don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted gently. "It's not about what I have. It's about what we can do together. You don't have to carry this burden alone." Her eyes filled with emotion as she searched his face, unsure whether to believe him. She had learned the hard way to depend only on herself, to keep her hopes small and her dreams practical. But Elian wasn't asking her to do it alone. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "Just let me be there." The moment stretched between them, heavy and intimate, and for the first time, Nyx allowed herself to truly consider what a life with Elian could look like. It wasn't a fantasy. It wasn't impossible. It was real. But as the night deepened, Elian couldn't help but wonder if their love could truly survive the battles ahead. Would his family accept Nyx? Would Dirya continue to sabotage them? And most importantly, could they create a life together when the world seemed so determined to keep them apart? The answers were uncertain, but as he looked into Nyx's eyes, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Elian woke to the soft morning light filtering through his bedroom window. The hospital was quiet this early, and for once, the familiar hum of machines and distant voices felt like a comforting background, rather than an oppressive weight. It had been a long journey since he had first awakened from his coma, and everything had changed. He had changed. And now, as he lay in the silence of his room, his thoughts kept drifting to the one person who had been there for him through it all, Nyx. She had stayed by his side in ways that no one else had, offering comfort when it was most needed, and strength when he was at his lowest. Her kindness, humility, and fierce loyalty had become a balm to his wounded soul. More than that, though, her quiet but unwavering belief in him had inspired him to start questioning everything he had been raised to believe about the world, about wealth, about what truly mattered. But today felt different. It was the day of his big family gathering, the event that had been planned for months, a gala meant to celebrate his recovery and mark the beginning of his return to the public eye. There would be donors, board members, and his fiancée, all gathered under one roof to honor the legacy of his family. And while he had once thought this was the pinnacle of success, the thought now felt hollow. The more he thought about his future in the world of high society, the more he realized how empty it had always been. Nyx was the one who had helped him see that. The quiet, unassuming hospital worker had become the most important person in his life, and he couldn't continue pretending that his old life meant anything when he had someone like her to care for. Elian had spent days carefully considering his choices. He had to make a decision, one that would affect not only his future but Nyx's as well. It was time to break away from the expectations that had been placed on him, to carve a new path. And he knew that if he wanted to move forward with her, he would have to do something bold, something that would shake everything up. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Dirya's name, but he hesitated. She would be at the event, expecting him to be the same Elian, the one who obeyed every demand, who kept up the facade of a perfect life. But that wasn't who he was anymore. Elian typed a short message, more for himself than for Dirya. "I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore." Then he hit send, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders as soon as the words left him. Later that afternoon, he found himself pacing outside the hospital, waiting for Nyx to arrive. His mind was a jumble of thoughts, of what-ifs and possibilities. What if she didn't feel the same way? What if she wanted to go her own way, away from the complications of his world? He couldn't blame her if she did. He had no illusions about the challenges that lay ahead for them, but he couldn't live in a world without her. When Nyx finally appeared, her face was soft with the gentle exhaustion of a long day's work. But the moment her eyes met his, Elian knew this was the moment. This was the turning point. There was no going back now. "Hey," she greeted him with a tentative smile, her brow furrowing when she noticed the serious expression on his face. "Is everything okay?" Elian took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I've made my decision," he said, his voice firm but not without hesitation. "I can't go to the gala tonight. I can't live this double life anymore." Nyx's face softened, though her expression was still uncertain. "Elian, what are you talking about? You have to go. It's important to your family, to your business." "I don't care about any of that anymore," he said, stepping closer to her. "I care about you, and I want to be with you without all of this." He gestured to the world around them, to the wealth, the expectations. "Without the pressure. I want to live a life that's real, Nyx. With you." She opened her mouth to protest, but he continued before she could speak. "You don't have to worry about anything. I'm not asking you to change or give up anything, but I'm asking you to give us a chance. You and me together. Away from all this." Her eyes searched his face for a long moment, the uncertainty lingering in her gaze. But then, slowly, she stepped forward and placed her hands on his chest, looking up at him as if trying to read him, to make sure he wasn't simply caught up in some fleeting moment of rebellion. "I've never known anyone like you, Elian," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I never thought this was possible. I didn't think I'd ever have a chance at something like this." "You do," he said, cupping her face gently. "We do." There was a long pause, and for a moment, it seemed as if time had frozen between them. But then, slowly, Nyx nodded, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's do it. Together." Elian's heart raced as he kissed her then. A soft, slow kiss that spoke of all the promises they had made to each other, of everything they had yet to face. And when they pulled away, he knew that they had made the right decision. It wouldn't be easy, this path they were about to walk. There would be obstacles, and there would be people who would try to tear them apart. But Elian was no longer afraid. With Nyx by his side, he could face anything. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Elian held Nyx's hand and knew that this was just the beginning. Whatever came next, they would face it together, stronger and braver than ever before. And for the first time in a long while, Elian believed that anything was possible.